When the news broke that Phil Robertson had taken his last breath, his family expected heartbreak. But they never expected what came next. The man who spent his life preaching simplicity, faith, and discipline left behind something far more complicated than anyone imagined. And when the lawyer finally opened the envelope containing his final instructions, every member of the Robertson family went dead silent. They had braced themselves for grief, but nothing could have prepared them for the legacy Phil left written in his own hand. The final days of a tough man. In the months leading up to May 2025, Phil Robertson's health declined in a way none of his children were emotionally ready to face. The man they had always known as unshakable, the one who hunted through storms, preached with fire, and lived by his own no-nonsense code, was slowly slipping away. When the family publicly revealed in December 2024 that Phil had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, most fans assumed it meant years of gradual decline. But the reality inside the Robertson home? Man, it was way more painful than that. The progression of the disease was brutally fast, attacking not only his memory, but his physical strength too. In the early months, the changes were subtle. Misplaced objects, repeated questions, long pauses mid-conversation. At first, you could brush it off. But before long, the forgetfulness turned into full-blown episodes of disorientation. Phil sometimes struggled to remember the day of the week, or he would start telling a story and then just blank out halfway through. Small moments, yeah, but terrifying ones. These were harsh reminders that the man who built an empire with his bare hands and stood firm through decades of controversy was now fighting a battle he couldn't win, no matter how tough he was. By April 2025, the family couldn't keep it quiet anymore. On an episode of the Unashamed podcast, Jay spoke with raw honesty and heartbreak. "He's not good," he admitted. "We're making him comfortable." Those few words said everything. The world finally understood what the family had been quietly carrying. Phil Robertson, the patriarch, the leader, the voice of faith and tradition, was fading. His body weakened. Simple routines needed help. His voice, once strong and steady, softened so much that even talking too long left him drained. The disease wasn't just messing with his mind. It was hitting everything. And yet, in the middle of all that decline, Phil stayed remarkably calm. He had talked about death for years. Never scared, always certain. To him, death wasn't the end. It was just the next chapter. "Don't cry when I die," he would tell his children. "Dance, sing, but don't cry." He said it so often it became almost like a family slogan, something he fully expected them to stick to when the time came. But when that final day showed up, yeah, nobody could follow that rule. In the early hours of May 25th, 2025, Phil passed away at home, surrounded by the people who loved him most. He was 79. The moment was quiet, almost peaceful, but the weight of it? Massive. His son Jace was the first to share the news publicly. "My dad has gone to be with the Lord today." Willie and Corey followed with a message filled with both sadness and gratitude, grieving hard, but thankful for every single year they had with him. The funeral that followed was exactly what Phil would have wanted. No reporters, no cameras, no politicians trying to slide in for attention. Just family, close friends, and that heavy kind of silence that only comes after decades of shared life. They prayed. They told stories. They tried not to cry like he asked. Most of them failed. The grief hit too deep. The love was too real. But it wasn't the funeral that truly broke the family. It was what happened right after. When they gathered in the lawyer's office to hear Phil's final words. The will, the handwritten letters, the choices he made long before his mind started to fade. That's when it all cracked open. That was the moment the tears really came. Because for the first time, they understood something heavy. Phil's final days weren't just about dying. They were about setting his family up for life without him. The will that shattered the room. The reading of Phil Robertson's will happen the day after the funeral, behind closed doors in a lawyer's office in West Monroe. Present were Miss Kay, his wife of more than 50 years, their sons Alan, Jace, Willie, and Jep, and Phyllis, the daughter Phil discovered late in life, but embraced completely, no hesitation. They expected a standard breakdown of assets. Simple, straightforward. What they got? Something deeply personal. Phil had written handwritten letters to each one of them. No assistance. No typed pages. No polished legal language. Just Phil's handwriting. Uneven, shaky from illness, but undeniably his. These letters weren't about money. They were confessions. Apologies. Blessings. Final words of guidance. Each envelope held not just a portion of his estate, but a personal explanation, why he gave it, what he hoped they would do with it, and how he wanted them to carry the torch forward. His net worth, estimated between $10 million and $15 million, came from decades of grinding it out. Duck Commander, Duck Dynasty, book deals, licensing, years of conservative podcasting and speaking gigs. But the real shock? It wasn't the cash. It was the meaning tied to every single decision. Miss K received full ownership of the family estate, the land they built together back when they were scraping by, eating food from the swamp just to survive. Alan, the former pastor, received Phil's lifelong collection of religious writings. Jace and Jep received proportional shares of Duck Commander, along with responsibilities Phil described as guarding the tradition, not selling out, not watering it down. Phyllis received land and a handwritten apology for the years she lived not knowing who her father really was. And then there was Willie, the son who took Duck Commander into mainstream America. He inherited the controlling stake in the family business, along with a message that read, "Protect the faith. Protect the legacy." When the last envelope was opened, that's when it really hit. Tears fell, not because of what they gained, but because they fully understood what they'd lost. A legacy built in the swamps. To understand why Phil Robertson's will carried so much emotional weight, the family had to rewind all the way back to the beginning. Long before TV cameras, before merch lines, before book tours, Phil was just a broke kid from Louisiana trying to make it. Born in 1946, he grew up in a home where hunting wasn't some weekend hobby. It was survival. His family was so poor that dinner often depended on whatever he could pull out of the swamps that day. That struggle shaped him. Tough, stubborn, self-reliant, and deeply skeptical of anything that pulled him away from the land. But Phil wasn't just some swamp kid. The man had talent. Serious talent. His athletic ability earned him a football scholarship to Louisiana Tech, where he became the starting quarterback in 1966 and 1967. And sitting right behind him as backup, Terry Bradshaw, who would later become an NFL legend. Wild, right? Most people would have stayed, chased the NFL dream, fought for the spotlight. Phil didn't. In one of the most defining moves of his life, he walked away from football because it clashed with duck season. "I'd rather hunt ducks than have large, violent men stomp me in the dirt." It sounded funny, sure, but it was deeper than that. That was identity. He chose freedom over fame. Every single time. And in 1972, he turned that freedom into a business. Duck Commander kicked off as a tiny hustle run straight out of his house, where he hand-carved duck calls and shipped them out one order at a time. Miss K, pregnant at 17 and then raising their kids, stood right beside him through every single hardship. For years, they've barely had enough cash to scrape by, leaning on faith and whatever they could pull from the bayou. But the business grew, slow at first, then steady, and eventually boom, explosive, when Willie came back from college with a vision to level everything up. The empire that formed, the empire that later made Phil a multimillionaire, was built on poverty, sacrifice, and tight family unity. That's why the letters in his will hit so hard. Each child wasn't just getting money. They were getting a whole chapter of a story written across generations. Fame, controversy, and the man who would not bend. The world didn't know Phil Robertson through the swamps of Louisiana or the grind of his early marriage. They met him in 2012 when Duck Dynasty premiered on A&E. At first, the show was supposed to be a simple reality program about a family running a duck call business. Instead, it blew up into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. At its peak, more than 11 million viewers tuned in every week to watch the bearded patriarch drop blunt truths about faith, family, and discipline. What people saw on TV wasn't some act. That was the exact man Phil had always been. But fame didn't soften him up. If anything, it made him louder. In 2013, An interview with GQ sparked one of the biggest controversies of his career. Phil spoke bluntly, too bluntly, some folks believed, about homosexuality and race, saying gay relationships went against God's design and that black Americans were happy under Jim Crow laws. The backlash was instant. A&E suspended him for a while. Advertisers started backing off, and civil rights groups demanded apologies. But conservatives rallied behind him. Hashtags supporting him went viral. Duck Commander merchandise sold out like crazy. A&E, overwhelmed by public pressure, brought him back within weeks. Phil didn't budge. He never apologized, saying his beliefs came straight from Scripture. Over the next decade, he became a steady presence in conservative politics. He backed Ted Cruz during the 2016 presidential run and later supported Donald Trump. To some, he was the face of religious conviction. To others, the face of intolerance. Yet Phil seemed untouched by both praise and outrage. He believed he was doing what God expected. No more, no less. Behind closed doors, though, the family felt the weight of all that fame. Ratings eventually dipped, and Duck Dynasty wrapped up in 2017 after 11 seasons. More spin-offs followed, Going Cyril, Jep and Jessica, Growing the Dynasty, At Home with the Robertsons, and Duck Family Treasure. Then in January 2025, A&E announced Duck Dynasty. The revival would return with the next generation. Phil wouldn't be part of it. Alzheimer's had already taken too much. Still, his presence stayed the backbone of the whole franchise. His convictions, controversies, and choices shaped his fortune, but they also shaped the load his family would carry. The man behind the fortune. Faith, failure, and redemption. Long before Phil Robertson became a cultural force, he was a man this close to losing it all. A lot of Duck Dynasty fans never knew about the darker years that nearly wrecked his family. In his 20s and early 30s, Phil battled alcohol, violence, and a temper that left deep scars on his marriage. Kay, who married him at just 17 after getting pregnant with their first child, held that home together with tears and prayer. By Phil's own later accounts, he disappeared for days at a time, swallowed up by heavy drinking and reckless living. The family stayed in constant doubt, never knowing if he'd come home sober, furious, or not at all. Then came the turning point. One day, in a small church in West Monroe, Phil walked in restless and defiant, and walked out changed. He embraced Christianity with a fire that would steer every choice he made for the rest of his life. From that day forward, he rebuilt his marriage, asked his kids for forgiveness, and poured his energy into working, providing, and teaching. His conversion didn't just flip his own life around. It reshaped the entire Robertson family. Faith became the heartbeat of everything he touched. The business, the books he wrote, the speeches he gave, and the podcast Unashamed that he hosted with Jason Al. On that podcast, Phil talked the way he lived, straight up, no filter, rooted in Scripture. Even in his last months, as Alzheimer's slowly stole pieces of him, his words stayed shockingly clear. Listeners couldn't believe he was as sick as his children said. His voice was steady. His convictions didn't waver. This was the Phil Robertson his family honored in that will. Not just the millionaire, not just the TV personality, but the man who climbed out of his own mess and spent decades living the faith he preached. The fortune he left was real, but the redemption that built it, that's what made his family break down. The farewell marked the end of an era. As the family absorbed the emotional punch of the will, another truth settled in. Phil Robertson's death wasn't just personal. It closed the door on a generation. He came from a time and culture that doesn't really exist the same way anymore. Self-made Southern entrepreneurs who built with their hands, trusted God above everything, and pushed back hard against modern culture. When he passed, that chapter closed for the Robertsons. After his Alzheimer's diagnosis went public in December 2024, fans all over America braced themselves. But inside the family, the decline hit faster than expected. By early April 2025, Jay said on Unashamed that Phil was not good, adding, "We're making him comfortable and we're doing the best we can." Even so, Phil recorded a few final podcast episodes, and his voice barely sounded touched by the disease. Those episodes now feel like a last gift, a final word from a man who always spoke with certainty. The private funeral after his passing on May 25th, 2025 looked exactly like him. No politicians, no celebrities, no cameras, just his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and a tight circle of locals who'd known him way before the fame and all the hype. There was laughter through tears, scripture readings, and long silences heavy with shared memories. Even while grieving, the family stepped into the responsibility he left behind. Willie moved into his role as majority owner of Duck Commander. Jace kept the podcast rolling. Jep carried his part of the brand's legacy. And A&E geared up for Duck Dynasty, the revival, premiering in summer 2025. The first season without Phil physically there, but packed with his influence. Those letters in the will weren't about how to manage cash. They were reminders of identity, who they were, where they came from, and what Phil expected them to stand on. That's why the tears came. The fortune mattered, sure, but the responsibility and the love tied to it, that meant way more. What part of Phil Robertson's final message hit you the hardest? Drop it below. And if you want more stories about the people who shaped our culture in unforgettable ways, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for the next chapter.